Next up is the co-founder of Evmos, Federico Kunze Küllmer, and he will talk about lessons learned from Evmos token model. Please give him a warm welcome, please. All right, stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Initially, I was going to be talking today about tech, IVC, how Evmos enables seamless interoperability between smart contracts and the rest of the Cosmos ecosystem. But based on community feedback, the main sentiment is Evmos has great tech and is enabling all these amazing functionalities for smart contracts and Cosmos app chains. But there's little talk about the tokenomics, so this is our first attempt after numerous conversations over the past weeks of how we can improve the current problems that we're seeing on the initial token model that was designed in the bull market, but then afterwards, as Sunny was mentioning, there was a Terra collapse, Nomad hack, and series of events in the macroeconomic environment that made the initial token design unsustainable in the long term. So this is our first attempt to identify those problems and also talk about how we're moving forward. So the Evmos token model V1, at a high level, it had a 4-year target emission schedule with an emission function that defined a half-life where it had a decay factor where every year the token will be half. The token emissions will be half for that period. Then there's a distribution of emissions. Once those tokens get minted, how are they distributed towards the different pools, a staking, community pool, usage incentives, etc. And then we had the usage incentives, which was our initial attempt to create a better distribution of these tokens that were newly minted. So first of all, the main problem that we identified was the emission schedule. So initially, as I was mentioning before, we had a 4-year target, but the main problem with the emission schedule was that these tokens were defined for the entire period and then minted until the end of the epoch, that is yearly in this case. But this yearly epoch is very problematic because it doesn't react well to the macroeconomic changes or any changes in the ecosystem and the crypto ecosystem. So how about changing into daily so that it provides a better and smoother transition into the next epoch so that it's not such a big of a crash as we had 2 days ago, I believe, when we had the first half-life period. So that decreased the staking emissions significantly. The next issue that we were able to identify was, okay, the token economic function that was designed during the bull market was meant to, according to this emission schedule, onboard as many users as possible, have as many early adopters, and this together with the rec drop, the airdrop that we designed to align and incentivize Cosmos ecosystem contributors, liquidity providers, stakers, and also users of main gas guzzler contracts in the Ethereum ecosystem. So the main problem with this, and we don't need to go into the function, but basically what this was defining is like a function based on an initial supply, and with this decay function based on a time period. It also had a variable that said how much influence would the staking bonding ratio have into these newly emitted tokens. But again, as Sunny was mentioning right before me, there needs to be elasticity to adapt to these macroeconomic environments, and this was not reflecting this. So our attempt to fix it is designing the next version of these emissions function. The next main issue that we were able to identify within our team was how is the distribution of tokens? So for the ones that are familiar with the internals of the token distribution of the Cosmos ecosystem, this distribution follows what is called the F1 fee distribution. I think it's after Formula 1 from Dave Oja was one of the main, and Chris Ghost were one of the main ones that worked on this. in early 2019, which provides an efficient allocations of staking rewards via passive accounting. So this allows the protocol to keep track of how much it owes to certain validators and delegators without having to occur into expensive computation. So in this sense, it was very effective in that purpose. And so you would submit a transaction at demand, and you will withdraw those to your wallets. But there are also certain limitations with it because it doesn't allow auto-compounding because, again, computationally expensive. And then there's like the tax efficiency issue that I'm going to be talking now that creates even more share pressure into all of the Cosmos ecosystem tokens whenever there's tax reports in each jurisdictions. So now that we talk about how the tokens are minted, distributed, so how about how those tokens are held across the different network actors, the token holders in this case? So we said before that the token economics in Cosmos ecosystem, especially when the allocation of staking rewards, is according to this F1 distribution. But the main problem of this implementation is that it's not modular. So the main problem that it has is that there's a pro rata allocation of the staking rewards according to the voting power of each actor, validator, or delegator. This creates an incentive for, or this creates a problem of the richer get richer problem. So if you have more tokens, you receive more rewards. And that accentuates the problem, especially when you have restaking through authorizations or other mechanisms that now exist in the Cosmos ecosystem. So how do we fix this in the long term? Here it's, for example, the Gini coefficient of the wallets in the Cosmos hub. I'm going to show Evmos later, but it's around 0.56, which is not great. The lower the Gini coefficient, the better. And the distribution of the wallets needs to improve over time. So how do we create a uniform distribution so that promotes network decentralization and prevents bad behavior from different actors or whales? So now the incentive model that was part of the Evmos ecosystem is that, okay, we wanted to create this flywheel of incentives through the usage incentives, a revenue share between through transaction fees for developers. And so we wanted to create this incentivized model to design a healthy ecosystem of decentralized applications. But we had different mechanisms that I'm going to talk about it, particularly. Okay, it's not very clear, but the first one is developers propose user incentives to bring more growth to their decentralized applications. Unfortunately, we identified that how developers work in the Ethereum ecosystem, they were not familiar how Cosmos governance worked. There were still some limitations in terms of, okay, how do I create a proposal? There's education, there's guides. There was no UI for creating proposals in the first place. And initially, Kepler or MetaMask Kepler in particular didn't also support Ledger. So that was also that main limitation factor. So if they are not able to propose these new incentives, basically the entire flywheel is broken right now. And then when these incentives are driving users and rewarding with more Evmos tokens, this is not happening anymore. Then there's like users that spend Evmos to use dApp services without incentives, without a liquidity mining program. There's no much utility also because the high staking emissions that I was explaining before made that the Evmos protocol was cannibalizing also numerous applications. So it was competing against each other for yield opportunities. So in fact, one of the early problems in the ecosystem was that the lack of deep liquidity was affecting indexes, was affecting the lack of lending market. And so these user adoption that we wanted initially through this flywheel of incentives didn't happen. And then developers earn Evmos fee from the usage of the smart contracts to earn more TVL. We had this model of like how transaction fees get split traditionally in the Cosmos ecosystem. all of them goes to the validator set and to their corresponding delegators. Now in Evmos, we introduce a way for that to be shared across developers, smart contract deployers, and also stakers, according to EIP 1559, which is the token model from Ethereum ecosystem. But given that the transaction fees were really low, there wasn't enough revenue to pay for operational expenses, which is the main pain point, especially for new teams that are jumping into crypto and deploying their smart contracts to Evmos. So, okay, this is our issues that we identified. These are the issues that we identified. So how do we move forward from now on? And this is our first attempt, as I was mentioning, is the Evmos token model v2. This is not anything that is set in stone. It might change over time as we gather more community feedback and also from the network stakers and all the relevant stakeholders. So at a high level, the goals that we want to set for the new token model v2 is that for developers, enable new use cases, enable as much usability as possible. As Yas was mentioning from Celestia, build whatever on Evmos. So enabling this functionality to access deep liquidity in the Cosmos ecosystem, enable new use cases through interchain composability is very important for these developers, and we'll be enabling those new use cases with our upcoming EVM extensions. Then for users, provide a smooth onboarding experience so that abstracting transaction fees, having smooth onboarding from the rest of the Cosmos and Ethereum ecosystems, etc. And for the rest of the ecosystem, provide incentives to develop a healthy DApp ecosystem. Today, we still lack many of the categories on the DeFi Llama top protocols board. And so our next attempt is to solve that through our token model v2. And adaptability, what Sunny was explaining before, there needs to be some structure, but also some flexibility to adapt to new changes in the environment, to basically account for also the macroeconomic situation that is going on today in the world. So now the emissions function that I was explaining before, that was good for early adopters, and today one of the good things that we learned from our previous design is that now Evmos is amongst the top protocols in the Cosmos ecosystem according to monthly active users. So there's a huge usage of Evmos users. So now how do we drive that usage into the different decentralized applications more than just staking or IVC? So the emissions function needs to take into consideration, and I didn't put the draft function that we have because again it might change. I don't want it to be circling around. But it needs to take into account the network demand, as Sunny was saying. Like ideally, in a healthy ecosystem, you want lower emissions, less inflation, but higher demand from transaction fees that is directly funding the cost of operating expenses from developer teams, from validators that are running the network. It also needs to take into account the Evmos liquidity in the network, so like how much liquidity which is necessary for the trifecta of decentralized applications that need to exist for a healthy ecosystem to develop, which are DEXs, lending protocols, and I missed the third one. Anyways, but yeah, there needs to be deep liquidity in the network, and this emissions function needs to take that into account. And then, of course, the bonding ratio, which is important for the Cosmos ecosystem to provide as much security as possible. And there needs to be a parameterization of these different variables through weights, in the same way that deep learning works for the ones that are familiar how AI works, that we can optimize for based on the different conditions at a given time in the network. So you can see here like how Ethereum changes its emissions daily based on the of the base fee, which is a direct function. So their emission schedule is direct function, or the burning in this case, is direct function of the network utilization. So now with now that we are working on the distribution and the emission function, how those tokens get minted in the first place, how do we allocate them into in particularly the liquid pools, in this case staking, because the remaining one goes to the community pool, which is useful for incentives. But what matters here is like how these affect end users, which is part of the staking pool at this point in time. So the first step is providing a flexible distribution of rewards that can be modified so that we can, in the long term, have a more uniform distribution of these tokens, again, affecting the Gini distribution. It needs to be capital efficient. For the ones that are familiar with distribution, how it works is you have a global pool of staking rewards that then, when you submit this on the at-demand transaction, goes to your wallet. But what happens when you need to restake or when you don't want to claim all these rewards? The current distribution design enforces you to withdraw all the rewards and resets the counter for the validator that you're delegating to, so that it can take into account a new period of distribution. So that forces a taxable event, which is not capital efficient. So how do we redesign this staking and distribution architecture to take into account a more healthy, capital efficient design that can be streamlining all these rewards directly to liquidity, to more security through staking, without having to force a taxable event, and that also limits and reduces the sell pressure according to the different calendars in the different jurisdictions. This will enable auto-compounding, so more security provided to the network, and we're going to be making this available to the rest of the ecosystem, because I think this is a very important improvement for the current design of the Cosmos SDK, and in general in the Cosmos ecosystem, that initially was architected so that you can have the default configuration, which is staking and distribution, but other modules could design its new distribution, incentives, etc. So it's about time that we can provide these ground level work, that all the applications can change its distribution logic, its emission logic, and the staking behaviors as well. So now the network distribution. What happens with the Gini coefficient? So we, on Evmos, will be designing a new staking incentives program to also incentivize the bottom of the delegation of the validators in the ecosystem, also through foundation delegation, but the staking incentives will be on-chain to provide more incentives instead of minting more tokens that are, again, going directly to pro rata with the voting power, as I was mentioning before. We can create incentives to delegate to the bottom layer of the validator set. And then there's like numerous UX improvements. The one that we've been exploring with is that how you can change the visualization of the validator set so that it disincentivizes more accumulation of voting power on the top validators. And if we display them with a gallery view, for example, this will create better description, better engagement with the different validators. So that's how we want to affect the distribution of the network in the long term. And then for incentives, leveraging governance, which is very important. The current balance of the community pool in Evmos is 121 million Evmos, but it hasn't been used because of, again, UI issues. There needs to be like lobbying with the validator set. And so how can we leverage the huge amount of tokens that we have at the moment to provide incentives to bring more applications, provide incubation, and develop a healthy ecosystem? So a better and a more effective use of governance is required to provide incentives to the different layers and the different categories that we want to do. The first of them is expedited proposals and custom quorums. Osmosis already developed some of these improvements that are already live on chain, but it's really important for having a better UX when it comes to governance. The governance EVM extensions, which is more on the tech side, but this is going to enable a new generation of DAOs that are going to be building using the base layer infrastructure of the governance on Evmos, and then sub-DAOs that are going to be part of the community, but streamlining all those initiatives into specific areas of focus, like, for example, business development, marketing, community support, etc. So that's how we want to provide different incentives, work together with our community, which is very active at the moment. And then, what about liquidity? We talk about liquidity and how the lack of liquidity affected the different applications in the Cosmos ecosystem, in the Evmos ecosystem. The liquidity accessibility is extremely important because most of the liquidity at the moment is concentrated on Osmosis. But unfortunately, until now, this is not available to decentralized applications, which were constrained in the EVM environment without having access to this deep liquidity that was available on Osmosis. So TVL, in the stricter sense of word, needs to be redefined for the interchain ecosystem if we're enabling interchain composability. So how can we enable these decentralized applications on Evmos to access liquidity that is directly on Osmosis, Injective, Kujira, and other main dexes in the Cosmos ecosystem, and use that to build the money Legos that they need for their DeFi ecosystem? So we are going to be introducing the Osmosis Outpost on Evmos that is going to be allowing these decentralized applications, DeFi applications more specifically, to build using liquidity that is available on Osmosis, provide incentives, provide liquidity, and using that as yield farming opportunities on the Evmos EVM. So how it will work is basically a transaction will be made from the decentralized application that would tap into the IVC Outpost for Osmosis, send a transaction over to Osmosis with a set of instructions, either swapping or providing liquidity, and then getting the acknowledgement back on the Evmos chain, specifically that will be read by the decentralized application, which will provide some conditional logic based on a success or result, or error result from the acknowledgement. So this is how we want to enable like cross-chain interoperability between decentralized applications and app chains on Cosmos to leverage liquidity that is not accessible right now on the Evmos chain. And then finally, interfluid staking, which is Osmosis' attempt to provide a superfluid staking as a service for the rest of the interchain ecosystem. Osmosis has been working on this implementation that is going to be providing and allowing security to be provided directly from Osmosis, so you can LP tokens on Osmosis, and also provide that will secure the network itself on Evmos. Not only Osmosis as it currently works, but also through IVC and through composability, enable more security to be provided. So this will work not only with Evmos, but with the rest of the Cosmos ecosystem. But what we want to do is enable superfluid staking natively on Evmos so that we can leverage all the decentralized finance applications to also provide security to the network. And as I was mentioning before, that the emission function now needs to take into account liquidity. This will also work as a proof of liquidity mechanism that will help the emissions of the chain. So summarizing, the Evmos token model had a lot of flaws initially, was not elastic to the changes in the network, in the ecosystem. But now we're redesigning it based on the community feedback, our initial insights from the problems that we were identifying, so that we can create a better interchain ecosystem of decentralized applications, tapping into interoperability, composability, etc., providing incentive alignment between developers, validators, and also users. Thank you very much.